What if the greatest story Rob Reiner ever left behind wasn't a movie, not in a script, not told through laughter, romance, or applause-filled speeches? Instead, it was a quiet story, written in the language of law, through discreet decisions made late at night, through choices that only revealed their full weight after he was gone. Because when the spotlight faded in that Los Angeles house, what remained was not just silence, not just pain, and not even just unanswered questions. Before delving into this extraordinary story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any more content. Your support is what motivates us to continue telling stories that not everyone dares to listen to. A massive fortune, large enough to change a life, enough to rewrite even the most enduring relationships, enough to transform pure grief into something far more complex. And here's the question almost no one dares to ask aloud. Can a fortune be so great that it can tear a family apart instead of bringing it closer? Rob Reiner spent over 6 decades making the public laugh, cry, feel moved, believe in love, believe in justice, and believe that, after all, everything would eventually fall into place. But life doesn't operate according to script. It doesn't close neatly when things get tough. And it doesn't stop just because someone has been loved their whole life. From the outside, Rob Reiner's life seemed like a perfect Hollywood fairy tale. A breakthrough role that shaped a generation. A smooth transition to directing with films that became cultural milestones. A production empire quietly amassed wealth even long after the spotlight has faded. To the public, it's a flawless career path, full of triumphs and perfectly timed. But here's a truth few stop to consider. Success doesn't disappear when the introduction ends. It persists. It accumulates. And sometimes, it creates unforeseen problems. As Rob Reiner entered his final years, he was more than just a filmmaker or a familiar face. He became an institution, a brand, a vast intellectual property portfolio with royalties, post-production deals, and equity that continued to generate profit even in his sleep. While the public saw nostalgic interviews and warm tributes, behind the scenes, a different reality was quietly taking shape. Legal paperwork, lawyers, trusts, cold, hard decisions about who gets what and why. Ask yourself, if you amassed enough wealth to last for generations, how would you distribute it? Based on fairness, strategy, or emotion? Would you reward loyalty, independence, or need? Or would you try to control the future of those left behind from the afterlife? Because that's the inheritance that few talk about. It's not just generosity. It's power. The ultimate power a human being can wield. And power, even when stemming from good intentions, always leaves consequences. When news broke that Rob Reiner and his wife had been found dead in their home, a wave of shock swept through. Newspaper headlines changed by the hour. Speculation emerged faster than the truth. And at the heart of it all, a family thrust into the most devastating situation, grieving in silence, while the world watched every detail. One often expects unity, composure, a grief that is kept secret and dignified. But grief doesn't operate that way. It's chaotic. It's full of contradictions. And it becomes even more intense when it clashes with something as cold and precise as money. Imagine that moment. A house once filled with voices, laughter, everyday arguments, now shrouded in silence. The phone rings incessantly. Lawyers request appointments. Files are pulled from safes and filing cabinets. And amidst that chaos, a realization emerges. This isn't just a story of loss. This is a story of legacy. Because Rob Reiner left behind more than just memories. He left behind an estimated $200 million fortune. $200 million. Read that number slowly. Let it settle. It's not simply wealth. It's a system, a structure, a future already laid out. And when money reaches that level, it's no longer, this is what helps you. It becomes, this is how I decide how your life will unfold. Some inheritances can heal families. But there are also inheritances that start cracks that never heal. But there are also assets that expose long-standing cracks. And the question here isn't whether Rob Reiner loved his family. That's obvious. Too easy to answer. The real, far more unsettling question is this. Will the way he divides his fortune bring those left behind closer together, or will it inadvertently drive them apart forever? Because there's a truth about wealth that few want to acknowledge. Money doesn't create problems. It exposes problems. Resentments that were once suppressed have nowhere to hide. Old comparisons resurface. Childhood memories are revived in adult form. Who was favored more? Who tried harder? Who sacrificed more? And who let others down? Inheritance doesn't erase those questions. It amplifies them. And with a family tied to a big name like Rob Reiner, things become even more complicated. These dynamics don't operate in private. They exist under the scrutiny of public opinion, under the pressure of societal expectations. People often think that money will make things easier. But what if it does the opposite? What if it traps family members in roles established decades ago? What if it forces them to relive old wounds, while still smiling and pretending everything is fine? And what if that very wealth becomes an accusation? As you delve deeper into this story, you'll realize that Rob Reiner's journey isn't just about talent and timing. It's also about control, vision, and long-term plans built from an early age. You'll see how Hollywood's success has quietly reshaped family dynamics over decades, not just in a moment of explosive fame. You'll also see that decisions made rationally sometimes inflict the deepest emotional wounds. And gradually, you'll understand why this fortune doesn't bring relief. It brings tears. Because the focus of this story has never been just a number in a bank account. It's the question every parent, every creative person, every ambitious individual ultimately faces. What do you truly leave behind when you're gone? Money can be counted. Love cannot. And when those two things clash, the consequences can last longer than any illustrious career. This isn't just the story of Rob Reiner's wealth. This is the story of what happens when a lifetime of success collides with the deepest loss. And as we move on to the next chapter, one thing becomes clear. To understand why this fortune is so damaging, we must first understand the man everyone thought they knew. Because the public image is only half the story. The other half has been silently shaping everything for a long time. So what happened? The next moment changed everything, in a way no one expected. How could a man who once made millions laugh leave behind such a heavy silence? That question lingers as the story continues, returning to the point where everything began to crumble. Because before the enormous fortune, before the stacks of legal documents, before the pain clashed with the language of the law, there was once a man the world believed they knew completely. And that belief offered solace. Rob Reiner wasn't just a celebrity. He was familiar, intimate, like a friend someone once thought they knew very well. Someone who had been present in your life for decades. Someone who walked into your living room through a small screen, carrying a familiar voice, a precise rhythm, and a storytelling instinct that offered a rare sense of reassurance in Hollywood. That familiarity wasn't insignificant. It shaped expectations. And when those expectations crumbled, the pain was far deeper than if you hadn't known anything at all. Think about this. When people think of tragic legacies, they picture chaos, scandal, excesses, public crashes with countless warning signs. But Rob Reiner was different. His career didn't explode in controversy. It progressed steadily, orderly, almost meticulously. Success followed success. One phase transitioned seamlessly into the next. And it was that very smoothness that made what happened afterward all the more unsettling. Because no one was prepared for the breakdown that would come from someone who seemed so solid. The first image many people remember of him is Michael "Meathead" Stivic. Loud, stubborn, annoyingly serious. A character who constantly argued at the family dinner table, yet somehow still endeared to the audience. That role not only brought Rob Reiner fame, it made him a part of popular culture. In a time when television wasn't as fragmented as it is today, millions of people watched the same show at the same time. And Rob Reiner stood right at the center of that moment. What most viewers didn't realize was how early fame shaped the rest of his life. Early fame wasn't a reward. It was a duty, a standard that people expected you to maintain forever. And that pressure didn't disappear when the show ended. It stayed. It follows you. After the resounding success of All in the Family, Rob Reiner could have easily chosen an easier path. Many actors have done so, taking safe roles, making money, maintaining familiarity. But for him, that wasn't enough. There's a kind of ambition that's not loud, not ostentatious. It doesn't stem from insecurity or a craving for attention. It manifests itself in curiosity, vision, and a desire to understand how things work. And that's Rob Reiner. He didn't just want to be in the story. He wanted to shape it. So, he stepped behind the camera. And from there, the public story almost became legendary. Because his transition from actor to director was not only successful, but also increasingly solid with each film. Not small projects for a select few. Not inaccessible experiments. But stories that touch generations. Deeply moving love stories, yet not overly sentimental. Comedy that respects the audience's intellect. Drama that balances reason and emotion. A career built not on ostentation, but on understanding people. And that's what makes the later career change more difficult to accept than anything else. Each success reinforces a familiar belief. This man always understands what the audience wants. But there's a rarely mentioned paradox. When someone becomes an expert at reading the emotions of the crowd, it doesn't necessarily mean they deeply understand those closest to them. In fact, sometimes the opposite happens. When your intuition is constantly praised in public, you begin to believe it's right in every space, not just on screen. You gradually assume your judgment is always accurate, even in your private life. And that's where the silent cracks appear. Because family isn't the audience. Family doesn't applaud after every performance. Family doesn't offer enthusiastic praise when the story ends. Family remembers all the things you inadvertently overlook. Behind the polished interviews and carefully constructed public image, Rob Reiner is a man building something far bigger. It's not just art, it's structure, production companies, ownership, long-term contracts that generate profits not just once, but repeatedly. Money continues to flow, and even when he's not directly involved, it no longer feels like income, but more like a natural force, always pulling things forward. And as his influence expands, the gap between his public persona and how he operates in his private life widens. Not because he's hiding anything scandalous, but because the scale has changed. When you're young and struggling, decisions are often personal, immediate, and emotional. With power and wealth, decisions become strategic, long-term, and abstract. You stop thinking in terms of days and months. You start thinking in years, in decades. And when thinking spans decades, people are sometimes no longer seen as separate individuals, but as variables in a larger picture. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever made a perfectly logical decision that felt emotionally wrong? Now imagine that feeling when you have hundreds of millions of dollars in your hands. That's the version of Rob Reiner that most of the public has never seen. Not the perpetually smiling filmmaker, not the nostalgic television icon, but the planner. A man who understands that wealth, if not carefully managed, can break up a family just as quickly as it nurtured them. So he prepares early, very quietly, years before anyone thinks those calculations will become important. Because it's a hard truth to accept, empire builders don't leave their legacy to chance. They organize it. They structure it. They decide how much freedom, how many limitations, and how much guidance the next generation will have. And it is at that boundary that love and control can become indistinguishable from the outside. Everything remains calm. Interviews are measured and composed. The outward image remains undisturbed. There are no noisy disputes, no explosive moments in the press. But precisely because of this, when the consequences appear, they are far more severe. Because no one is prepared for the possibility that, beneath that calm exterior, decisions are powerful enough to reopen wounds that people thought had healed. And those wounds are not new. They have existed for a long time, only buried deep in silence. Beneath the veneer of success, things gradually fade with time, becoming quieter due to distance and routine, until one day they are no longer silent. When Rob Reiner died, the world mourned an artist, but his family mourned something entirely different. They mourned the version of himself they believed they knew so well. And that is a very different kind of pain. A pain not accompanied by applause or memorial films. It is accompanied by questions. Why? Why this decision? Why that time? And why not us? Because when someone seemingly predictable leaves behind surprises, it forces those left behind to look back at the entire past. Every conversation, every decision, every moment that seemed insignificant at the time it happened. Was it a sign? Was something preordained? What did we miss? And that's when the silence becomes unbearable. Because money doesn't answer the question. It just sits there, waiting to be explained, waiting to be debated, waiting for someone to assign it a meaning. As the story unfolds, you'll see that Rob Reiner's transformation from a beloved actor to a silent architect of wealth didn't happen overnight. It was built slowly, almost layer by layer, so subtly that it's almost imperceptible, until it's heavy enough to alter the emotional state of an entire family. And then you begin to understand why the man the public thought they knew might only be a part of his true self. Because the public image is warm and approachable, while his private plans are where things get complicated. Once you look deep into how his empire was built, there's an undeniable truth. Wealth doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's built intentionally. And intentions, whether stemming from foresight or a desire to protect, don't always lead to the expected results. What happens afterward will show how power, when operating silently, can reshape relationships. And almost no one is truly prepared for that. So what happens when the role that made your name won't let you go? That's the question simmering beneath the surface as the story unfolds. The public believes they understand origin stories. They like them concise, inspiring, easy to retell in interviews or reminiscences. But true origin stories don't end when the lights go out. They resonate long after the applause dies down. For Rob Reiner, that resonance has a name everyone knows: Meathead. That nickname alone speaks volumes about the power of the role. Michael Stivic is more than just a character. He was an icon, a focal point of debate for an entire generation, embodying a changing America right at the family dinner table. Night after night, millions watched him clash with Archie Bunker. The old world met the new. Tradition collided with progress. Certainty confronted idealism. And Rob Reiner portrayed that conflict so convincingly that the line between actor and real person blurred, to the point that the final question was no longer for the character, but for him. Ultimately, who was the real person behind everything we thought we understood? If an entire nation believes they know who you are before you even truly understand yourself, how do you escape that persona? Fame that comes too soon doesn't give you a chance to experiment in silence. It doesn't allow for private stumbles. Every action is projected to the public. Every decision carries the weight of permanence. For a young actor, that can be both captivating and suffocating. Rob Reiner didn't just learn to act under pressure. He learned to think strategically within that pressure. Because when you become an icon of a cultural moment, you soon realize an uncomfortable truth. Conformity is more fragile than one might think. The beloved character of today can become a laughingstock tomorrow. And that fear doesn't disappear when you succeed. In many cases, it only grows, silently but persistently. So instead of continuing down the familiar path of acting, Reiner made a choice that surprised many. He stepped out of the spotlight and moved closer to control. Becoming a director wasn't just a creative turning point. It was a structural one. Actors depend on chance. Directors create opportunities. Actors wait to be cast. Directors decide which story is told. And for someone who had lived for years typecast by a single character, that transition meant more than any role. Behind the camera, Rob Reiner was no longer the loudmouth or the controversial figure. He was the decision maker, the one who set the rhythm, the one the entire crew listened to and respected. That shift in roles gradually reshaped how you see the world. When acting, you react. When directing, you anticipate. You think ahead about the outcome. You wonder what the audience will feel even before they realize it. You design the emotional experience. And when you do it well enough, it doesn't just stay on set. It follows you home. Film after film, all reinforcing the same pattern. Reiner wasn't just successful. He was consistently successful. And that consistency is dangerous in a very subtle way. Because failure teaches humility. Consistency teaches confidence. And confidence, if left unchecked, can harden into absolute certainty. When his directing career reached its peak, Rob Reiner became a name studios were willing to invest heavily in, actors were willing to trust, and audiences were willing to expect. Gradually, that trust wasn't limited to his work. It spread to every corner of his personal life. If your intuition is consistently right in your profession, why wouldn't you trust it in your family? It was here that the seeds of future conflict began to sprout, not from malice, but from motivation. As Reiner's projects continued to generate profits years after their release, he learned a lesson few people experience firsthand: the difference between income and wealth. Income comes and goes. Wealth remains. Wealth accumulates quietly, patiently, often invisibly. Royalties continue to flow in whether you think about it or not. Shares mature over time. Seemingly small clauses in a contract begin to multiply years after signing. Money is no longer something you pursue. It becomes something you manage. And managing always changes people. It changes conversations, shifts priorities, introduces seemingly cold but unavoidable concepts into life: protection, planning, structure. You no longer think only of the present. You start thinking about what will happen when you're no longer there. That's when inheritance planning no longer seems like excessive worry, but rather a responsibility. And responsibility, when viewed from the outside, is easily misinterpreted as control. While Rob Reiner continued to refine his public image as a calm, socially responsible filmmaker with profound thought, he also became familiar with another, quiet but equally powerful mechanism: the mechanism of inheritance. Not just artistic inheritance, but financial inheritance. Who owned what? Who benefited, and when? How assets were protected? How disputes were prevented? Or at least, that's what he believed he was doing. In retrospect, the irony is painfully clear. The more one tries to prevent conflict, the more one sometimes makes others feel controlled rather than trusted. But at the time, none of this seemed alarming. Everything was logical. Everything was cautious. Everything resembled the decisions a smart, responsible person would make. And that is the core contradiction of this chapter. Rob Reiner didn't become powerful overnight. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to control the future of everyone around him. Power came to him slowly, step by step, through a series of choices, each seemingly perfectly logical. And because those choices consistently yielded good results, no one questioned the direction. Not public, not private, not yet. Over time, Reiner's public image matured alongside the growth of his wealth. He spoke about culture, politics, art, and responsibility with a composure that earned him the trust of many. To many, he became the embodiment of a Hollywood conscience: intelligent, mature, and principled. But it is here that an uncomfortable question begins to form. When someone is seen as a moral authority in public, do they feel pressured to be perfect in their private life? And if so, what happens when real life doesn't operate according to those neat rules? Because families don't operate on ideology. Families operate on emotion, on memories, on remembered traumas, and unspoken expectations. And money doesn't erase those things. It amplifies them. As Rob Reiner's empire expanded, his family wasn't just watching from the sidelines. They were living right in its sphere of influence. Opportunity came with expectations. Support came with conditions, whether spoken or unspoken. Love was still present, but it was overshadowed by power, and power always changes the atmosphere. As Reiner entered the final stage of his life, he was no longer just a storyteller. He became a planner, a man who deeply believed in the ability to shape outcomes. And that belief ultimately expands to the question no one can avoid: what happens after you're gone? The tragic irony lies here. The very instincts that made Rob Reiner successful as a director, prediction, structure, emotional design, are also the instincts he relied on when planning his legacy. He believed he could lead the story even when the ending was imminent. But family isn't a movie. They don't follow a script. They don't accept an ending just because someone has meticulously prepared it. And when reality doesn't cooperate with intention, the consequences can be devastating. As we move on to the next chapter, we need to take a closer look at how Rob Reiner's success gradually transformed into something far beyond fame. Something quieter, more enduring, and far more powerful: the empire behind the curtain. Because the moment money starts working for you, instead of you working for money, all the familiar rules change. And it is the choices made during that period of life that leave the most lasting mark. What happens next will show just how profoundly control can reshape everything, from relationships to the ability to let go, something often far more difficult than people realize. What happens if success not only opens new doors, but simultaneously, in silence, locks other doors behind you? That's the unsettling question that begins to emerge as we delve deeper into this story. Because at this point, Rob Reiner is no longer pursuing recognition. He achieved everything the industry could give a person: awards, box office success, critical acclaim, and the unwavering trust of Hollywood. But success has a second phase that no one prepares you for. A phase where it no longer feels like achievement, but gradually transforms into the burden of expectations. In the later stages of his directing career, Rob Reiner didn't just make films. He offered assurance. For studios, his name didn't represent risk. It represented stability, predictability, a safe choice. That reputation was incredibly powerful, but also incredibly heavy. Because when everyone expects you to win, failure is no longer a creative possibility to explore. It becomes something to be strategically avoided. It is here that the legend of Rob Reiner as a reliable box office draw is solidified. Romantic comedies never go out of style. Dramas still resonate. His stories skillfully balance humor and depth, intelligence and relatable dialogue. Audiences trusted that he could make them feel something genuine without manipulation. And that trust directly translated into money. Not just upfront fees, but post-production deals, profit sharing, and long-term ownership. Such deals don't pay once and then end. They continue to generate profit for decades. This is what most people don't understand about Hollywood wealth. The biggest part of the money doesn't come from working harder, but from owning pieces of things that continue to generate value long after you've stopped. Rob Reiner understood this early on. Every successful film is not just a creative triumph. It becomes an asset, a living entity on television broadcast schedules, online platforms, physical collections, and playback packages. Each time someone presses the play button, a tiny signal travels through a complex system and eventually reaches their bank account. Initially, these signals arrive slowly. Then, they become regular. And then, they become incessant. At some point, money no longer feels like a reward. It becomes something like background noise, always present, always accumulating. When that happens, the way people perceive money begins to change. They no longer ask what it can buy. They begin to ask what it can protect. And protection becomes central to wealth at this level. Protecting assets, protecting control, protecting legacy. It is here that things begin to get complicated. Because legacy is not just about how the public will remember you. It is also about how those closest to you will live with the decisions you leave behind after you are no longer present. During this period, Rob Reiner wasn't just directing. He was building systems. Production structures, legal frameworks, and financial roadmaps were designed for long-term sustainability. In theory, it all made perfect sense. You can't entrust such a large asset to chance. You can't put the future on a whim. You have to plan. But planning always comes at an emotional cost. Because when you're the one designing everything, the rest of the people become beneficiaries, or variables that need to be factored in. And that shift, however subtle, is enough to tip the balance of relationships. Imagine sitting around a family dinner table, acutely aware that one person's decisions will shape everyone's lives long after they're gone, even if that person loved you deeply. Facing that reality, the imbalance is undeniable. This is not equality, and inequality, within the family, often hurts more than we are willing to admit. As Rob Reiner's fortune grew, so did the invisible walls surrounding it. Financial advisors replaced casual conversations. Inheritance planners entered what was once a private space. The language shifted from personal to procedural. Trusts, structures, safeguards. These aren't words that evoke warmth. They evoke caution. And caution, though necessary, often carries a sense of distance. Ironically, Rob Reiner's films often celebrate connection, communication, and understanding. But behind the scenes, his real-life story was increasingly layered. Not because of coldness, but because of responsibility. At least, that's how things were perceived at the time. And it is here that the contradictions begin to surface. a man renowned for his ability to tell emotionally charged stories, gradually began making emotionally neutral decisions. A director lauded for empathy started prioritizing efficiency. A family man, in the public eye, began thinking like a CEO in his private life. None of this happened overnight. It crept in little by little. It cloaked itself in the guise of maturity, wisdom, or doing the right thing. But what is right in theory isn't always right in human emotion. Over time, Rob Reiner's name became a symbol of a very unique kind of Hollywood credibility. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't reckless. He didn't chase trends. And because of that, people placed their complete trust in his judgment, including himself. That confidence is the key to the story. Because when you have absolute faith in your judgment, you stop inviting dissent. You stop asking difficult questions. You no longer wonder how those choices will affect others. And within families, few are willing to challenge the person who holds the solid foundation beneath their feet. Not necessarily out of fear, but because dependence complicates honesty. Would you dare speak the truth if it could be misunderstood? Would you dare object if it could easily be seen as ingratitude? These are the silent negotiations that take place within families shaped by wealth. And they don't erupt immediately. They accumulate, quietly, over time. Each unspoken thought silently piled up. Each avoided conversation made the atmosphere heavier than the last. From the outside, Rob Reiner's life seemed harmonious and stable. But from within, it was becoming structured, controlled, organized, and optimized to the maximum. And it was this optimization that often dulled the most subtle nuances of human emotion. As wealth increased, so did the desire to ensure it was used correctly. But the very concept of correct carried judgment. Correct according to whose standards? Correct for what purpose? And correct according to whose vision of the future? These are questions that cannot be answered while a person is still alive, in power, and in control. They are often postponed, pushed back, until they can no longer be ignored. As the story moves into its next phase, the focus shifts from the films themselves to what they quietly build behind the scenes. Because the story truly revolves not around success, but around scale. And once something reaches a certain scale, it no longer belongs to a single individual emotionally, even if legally it bears their name. Rob Reiner's golden touch created more than just entertainment. It built an empire. And every empire, however well-intentioned, leaves behind a legacy far more complex than its founders ever imagined. As the cash flow continued to grow, one thing became clear. This fortune wasn't simply to be shared. It had to be managed. And management always comes with oversight, rules, expectations, and consequences. But what followed revealed a profound paradox. An empire born from the art of storytelling begins to tell a very different story, one that no script can soften. What if the most important story never made it to the screen? That question arises as the glory of box office success fades into the background. The once celebrated numbers begin to transform into something less noticeable, yet with more lasting weight. While audiences are captivated by love stories, tense courtroom debates, and struggles for justice, behind the scenes, another story is quietly unfolding. No applause, no interviews, no praise. It's a story about ownership, and ownership changes everything. At a certain point in Hollywood, success is no longer measured by individual projects, but by the infrastructure behind them. Who holds the copyright? Who owns the library of works? Who benefits when a new generation rediscovers what was once created? Rob Reiner crossed that threshold quietly, one small deal at a time, one contract at a time, one percentage of profit accumulated at a time. No fanfare, no scandal, just persistence. This is the complete opposite of the public's common perception of wealth. People usually think of lavish mansions, sensational headlines, and ostentatious lifestyles. But true power rarely reveals itself. It is consolidated quietly. Reiner's most important step wasn't just directing successful films, but positioning himself as a key link in the equation for long-term profitability, even as the creative flow slowed. Production companies don't just create content. They own it, license it, repackage it, and exploit the value of collective memory. They monetize nostalgia, And nostalgia is one of the most stable and enduring revenue streams in the entertainment industry. Every rerun, every remake, every streaming deal, every anniversary re-release fuels the same machine. That machine doesn't care whether the creator is alive or dead. It is at this point that the concept of an empire no longer sounds like an exaggeration, but begins to take on its true meaning. Because an empire isn't measured by how much noise it makes, but by its ability to endure over time. Behind closed doors, Rob Reiner no longer thinks in terms of individual films. He sees everything as catalogs, libraries, values that can last for decades. The question is no longer, what will I do next, but what will still matter 20 years from now? That way of thinking changes the entire frame of reference. It changes how you look at money. It changes your perception of time. And most importantly, it changes how you look at people. When your work is placed within a structure designed to outlast you, you begin to believe that the future can be shaped, not by emotion, but by framework. That belief is very appealing. Because structure creates a sense of permanence. Emotions may fade, relationships may change, but legal frameworks, terms, and protective mechanisms appear stable, reliable, seemingly immune to misunderstanding. Or at least, they appear that way. As the empire grows, so does the complexity surrounding it. More income streams, more layers of ownership. Assets cannot be simply divided like cash in a bank account. You can't divide creative control equally. You can't fragment intellectual property without consequences. And ultimately, someone has to make the decisions. That person is Rob Reiner. This is the paradox most people overlook. The more complex the financial structure, the more concentrated the decision-making power becomes. Even if the initial goal was fairness, even if the intention was protection, complexity always demands control. And once control is established, letting go of it becomes incredibly difficult. In a family context, this creates a subtle imbalance, rarely spoken aloud. When one person holds the key to the treasure trove, the way conversations unfold changes. People think more carefully about their words. They hesitate before arguing. They wonder how their frankness will be interpreted. Not out of calculation, because they are human. And humans, however reluctant to admit it, are always adjusting their behavior to the dynamics of power. Over time, the empire behind the curtain becomes an independent entity, not cruel, not exploitative, simply present. An invisible but ever-present force, influencing decisions, vacations, homes, education, opportunities. Money is never seen as the central issue, but it's always in the equation. And that subtly changes how love is understood and expressed. Support becomes structured. Help comes with a plan. Everything is organized, optimized, scheduled. From the outside, it's responsibility and maturity. But from the inside, it can feel transactional. And this is what few people talk about. When wealth reaches a certain scale, people gradually stop questioning its emotional significance. Instead, the biggest question becomes how to preserve it. Preservation rises to the top priority. Not happiness, not naturalness, not even connection, but preservation. That priority is reflected in private meetings with advisors, in belated exchanges with lawyers, in documents drafted, edited, and rewritten repeatedly. Each version promises greater clarity, but at the same time subtly widens the gap between people. As Rob Reiner entered the final stage of his life, the empire was no longer something he actively built. It became something he maintained. And maintenance, in essence, is not creation, but prevention. Preventing risk, minimizing losses, controlling outcomes. This is the point at which succession planning ceases to be hypothetical and becomes imperative. What if something goes wrong? What if a dispute arises? What if the original intention is misunderstood? These questions are no longer philosophical. They become constant worries. The irony is that the more one tries to prevent conflict through structure, the more likely one is to create emotional conflict. Because structure doesn't know grief. It doesn't adapt to shock. It doesn't soften when people are vulnerable. It only operates. It only executes. And when that execution clashes with loss, the result is rarely peace. Rob Reiner probably believed he was doing the right thing. Most people in his position believed so. They believed that clarity would prevent chaos. They believed that thorough preparation would prevent hurt. They believed that if everything was written down clearly, no one would feel left out. But emotions don't follow text. They don't operate by terms. They react to how people feel, to pre-existing expectations, to a shared history that no document can fully summarize. As the empire grew stronger, family members were bound not only to Rob Reiner emotionally, but also by the systems he built. And systems are not easily changed. While he was present, that rigidity was softened by his ability to explain, adjust, and reassure. People could ask questions. They could argue. They could believe in his good intentions. But once he was gone, all that remained was the structure. Only the structure remained. And the structure doesn't speak for itself. It doesn't apologize. It doesn't explain. It doesn't clarify. It just stands still, waiting to be interpreted. And that's where things begin to tilt. Because interpretation is always personal. One person sees protection. Another sees restriction. One feels generosity. Another feels judgment. And in that moment, the empire behind the curtain stepped into the light. Not as a symbol of victory, but as the source of confusion, pain, and division. As the story moves to the next chapter, the focus shifts from how the empire was built to its true value. Not emotional value, but financial value. Because once the numbers appear on the table, everything accelerates. Expectations sharpen. The feeling of entitlement begins to creep in. Resentment finds room to grow. And the question is no longer, what does he want? But how much do I deserve? But what happens next will push those questions far beyond all expectations. Because it is those numbers, not the death, not the silence, not even the unspoken words, that deliver the real shock. What is the true scale of what remains? Because when the number $200 million is mentioned, it's not just overwhelming. It resonates. It echoes. It alters the entire trajectory of every conversation that follows. $200 million isn't simply money. It's gravity. It pulls everything toward it. Emotions, assumptions, expectations, even old memories thought to be dormant suddenly come alive. And the moment that number appears, the story is no longer abstract. It becomes so personal that it's unavoidable. Imagine this. You're still grappling with the loss, still replaying the last conversations in your head, still learning to live in the absence of someone who shaped your life in ways you're only just beginning to realize. And then, a number appears. Not whispered, not introduced gently. It's dropped, heavy, decisive, impossible to ignore. $200 million isn't a gift. It's a judgment. Because when wealth reaches that scale, it's bound to be compared. It invites measurement. It demands explanation. Who gets what? Why that number? What does it say about how he sees us? Money at this level is no longer neutral. It becomes symbolic. For some, it represents security. For others, it's recognition. And for still others, it's the validation they may have sought for decades without being able to name it. But in a grieving family, symbolism is a double-edged sword. Because grief amplifies everything. A small feeling of being overlooked becomes heavy. A technical decision becomes deliberate. A practical choice is perceived as a personal judgment. As the reality of the enormous fortune gradually emerged, emotions shifted. It was no longer a matter of whether or not it was being cared for. It became a question of the meaning behind the numbers. $200 million couldn't be random. Every decision was carefully considered. Every allocation reflected an intention, and every gap left an echo. That's when the silent questions began to form. They weren't spoken aloud, not publicly acknowledged, but they existed, persistent and not easily dispelled. Why this structure? Why these conditions? Why this timing? People often think wealth simplifies things. The reality is the opposite. It complicates everything far more. Because such a vast fortune doesn't exist as a single number. It's fragmented, layered, and intertwined with systems, entities, and mechanisms that aren't easily translated into human emotion. There are assets that cannot be divided without losing value. There are rights that require oversight. There are income streams that fluctuate depending on who controls them. And from there, the core question is no longer how much money there is. It's who controls what. It is this control that begins to build tension. When the scale of assets becomes clear, all involved are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. This isn't money to be spent impulsively. This is money to be managed. And that distinction is significant. Spending money is a personal act. Managing money is political. It creates hierarchies, oversight mechanisms, and unspoken rules. Suddenly, inheritance no longer feels like a gift. It becomes a matter of governance. Who makes the decisions? Who holds the power? Who is trusted? Who is watched? These are not questions any family is prepared to face. But the sheer scale of the estate compelled them to answer. And those answers were rarely emotionally satisfying. Because management always implies judgment. It implicitly suggests that some are more suitable, some are more trustworthy, some are more deserving of control than others. Even if no one says it outright, even if everything is wrapped in protective and cautious language, the message still resonates. As the details unfolded, one thing became clear. This estate wasn't designed for simplicity. It was built for longevity, for trusts rather than handouts, for structure rather than freedom, for conditions rather than unconditional checks. On paper, it all seemed logical and responsible, but in the human psyche, it weighed heavily. For some family members, a troubling question began to form. If he truly trusted us, why would he need so many layers of protection? And that question alone was enough to shake any sense of security that had existed before. Could reopening wounds that didn't originate from money inadvertently hurt others further? Because trust is never just about finances. It's about trust in wisdom, trust in independence, trust in a person's maturity. And when wealth comes with constraints, it's easily perceived as suspicion disguised under a veneer of concern. That's when the emotional weight of wealth becomes undeniably clear. The issue is no longer about who receives more or less, but about how things are distributed, whether people feel understood or left behind. Two people might receive the same amount of money, but their experiences are completely different, all depending on the context. One sees generosity, the other feels a limitation. One sees a door opening, the other sees a reminder of past disappointments. And that's the danger of leaving behind a vast fortune without resolving the emotional narratives associated with it. When silence sets in, those very stories fill the void. People begin to look back at the past through a different lens. Was the debate of yesteryear about values or about control? Was the advice given guidance or judgment? Was the distance then due to circumstances or a deliberate choice? Money becomes the interpreter of memory, and it's never a truthful interpreter. When inheritance becomes the focal point, the pain doesn't disappear. It transforms. Sadness blends with confusion. Confusion gradually turns into resentment. Resentment, in turn, brings with it guilt for daring to resent. After all, who would dare complain about inheriting? It's this guilt that paralyzes people. It suppresses true emotions, because no one knows how to express them without being seen as ungrateful. But gratitude and grief are not mutually exclusive. You may appreciate the security money provides, yet still regret the lost autonomy. You may be grateful for the provision, but at the same time feel bound by that very provision. That contradiction is a state many people fall into when wealth appears after a great loss. And for a family accustomed to living under public scrutiny, that contradiction is even harder to express. There is always pressure to appear calm, united, and respectful. But the inner world rarely aligns with the outward appearance. Behind closed doors, conversations begin to shift, not with accusations, nor with heated arguments, but with cautious word choices, indirectly asked questions, and silences where answers should have been. $200 million changed the entire situation. It forces people to confront truths they may have previously avoided. Are we truly equal here? Or have we never been? Has success united us? Or has it silently created invisible hierarchies? And perhaps the most painful question is the one no one dares to voice aloud. Does he understand what this feeling is like? That question doesn't stem from a demand. It stems from a yearning, from a desire to believe that love exists not only in intention, but also in the way things are arranged. As the scale of his fortune becomes clearer, another truth emerges. This money wasn't created to vanish quickly. It was built to endure. That means Rob Reiner isn't just thinking about the present. He's thinking about generations to come. And thinking about generations often clashes directly with personal experience. What benefits a family in the long term can feel stifling in the short term. What protects assets can inadvertently narrow life. What seems wise from afar becomes cold and distant up close. It is here that the real tension is revealed. Because when people realize their fortune is far greater than they ever imagined, they also realize something else. They are now part of a system they didn't create. A system that will last longer than grief, longer than anger, even longer than explanations. And systems don't adjust to emotions. They only reinforce the structure. From that point on, the story is no longer simply about money. It becomes a story about self-determination. Who has the right to decide? Who has the right to adapt? Who has the right to interpret intentions? And who is merely expected to accept? As we move on to the next chapter, these questions become unavoidable. Because when wealth reaches this scale, it brings more than just comfort. It creates roles: managers, beneficiaries, bystanders. And once these roles are defined, the relationships can no longer remain the same. Families inherit more than just money. They also inherit intangible positions within an established order. And not everyone feels comfortable in the position they've been assigned. But it is here that things begin to unravel. How deeply ingrained those roles are, and why an inheritance that should offer security gradually becomes a source of conflict rather than emotional support. What if the most difficult part of inheriting a vast fortune isn't the money itself, but accepting one's role in the family narrative? That question becomes even more weighty when attention shifts from the numbers to the people. Because money, no matter how large, is still an abstract concept. Family, however, is not. Rob Reiner's family existed long before his fortune reached its current scale, long before movies, before awards, before any empire was formed. That means relationships aren't built on a level playing field. They begin in childhood, in expectations, in familiar patterns never created to withstand the pressure of a multi-million-dollar fortune. From the outside, it's easy to assume that families connected to Hollywood legends are simply lucky, privilege, opportunity, doors opening automatically. But inside, those relationships are formed just like in any other family. Over the years, through personalities and circumstances, roles emerge. The one who bears responsibility, the rebel, the sensitive one, the one who always wants independence. Success doesn't erase those roles. On the contrary, it makes them more rigid. And when wealth arrives, those roles begin to be framed. Rob Reiner didn't just become a public figure. He became a center of change. His career wasn't simply a source of income. It shaped the entire family environment. The daily routine revolved around his work. Conversations centered around his commitments. Decisions, big and small, were influenced by his presence or absence. This wasn't unusual. It was the reality of families built on a foundation of ambition. But over the decades, that reality gradually transformed into a perception. Children didn't just witness success. They felt its absence. Relationships didn't just benefit from stability, but carried a sense of imbalance. Even when love was present and often genuine, the family structure subtly changed. Success didn't give warning when it distorted a relationship. It just quietly happened. As Rob Reiner's influence grew, his family was no longer bound together by mere kinship. They were bound to something bigger than themselves. It's not just emotional, but symbolic. They're not just family, they become part of the story. And every story comes with expectations. To be grateful, to be supportive, to be discreet. Those expectations rarely need to be spoken aloud. They are felt. Over time, they shape how each person disagrees, how they ask for help, and how they understand what independence means. Because independence in a wealthy family is never a simple concept. When resources are readily available, choices seem less risky, but at the same time, less free. If you succeed, is it because of your efforts, or because of the safety net always behind you? If you fail, is it because you didn't try hard enough, or because you weren't truly forced to try? These questions quietly exist in families shaped by money, and they don't disappear just because time passes or because someone is no longer present. The truth is, they didn't disappear. They became clearer, stronger. When Rob Reiner was alive, The family revolved around him, not in an imposing or oppressive way, but in a natural order. He was the anchor, the bearer, the one who made the final decisions. Even though he never raised his voice, never displayed his power ostentatiously, that structure was still very much present. One person built the foundation, the rest lived on that foundation. This doesn't mean resentment. It's simply reality. But reality becomes awkward when it's frozen. When Rob Reiner died, the structure remained, but the center was gone. And that's when the questions began to turn inward. Who are we without him? Who are we allowed to become? And who do others expect us to be? These questions don't have easy answers, especially when money becomes the lens through which everything is viewed. As the family began to delve into the specifics of the estate, old conflicts quietly resurfaced. Not through heated arguments or dramatic confrontations, but through nuances in tone, hesitation, and carefully chosen words that carried more layers of meaning than intended. One person inquired about a document. Another responded cautiously. The silence lasted longer than usual, because everyone sensed one thing very clearly. This was not just a story about inheritance. This was a story about identity. For years, the family members had shaped themselves through their relationship with Rob Reiner. As children, as partners, as companions, as individuals living in the shadow of a man too great. Now, that shadow remained, but the man who created it was gone. And shadows without a source always bring a sense of unease. Some found solace in the structure he left behind. It offers a sense of familiarity, stability, and predictability. Others feel bound by that very structure, as if the past has been locked away, leaving no room for renegotiation of which version of themselves they are allowed to become. Both reactions are very human. Neither is wrong. But when these opposing emotions coexist in a shared space, tension is almost inevitable. This is when the image of a perpetually united family begins to crack. Unity requires a shared understanding, and that understanding can vary greatly when grief is present. For some, managing the estate is a final act of care. For others, it is a continuation of control. Some feel protected, others feel marginalized. And because no one wants to be disrespectful to the deceased, those emotions are initially suppressed. But buried emotions don't disappear. They're just waiting for the right moment to surface. Family relationships are built on memories, not just shared moments, but the meanings each person remembers in their own way. Who felt supported? Who felt neglected? Who felt trusted? Who felt constantly watched? Money doesn't create those memories. It only awakens them. And as the conversations continue, one thing becomes clear. This family isn't really arguing about money. They're grappling with the messages that money inadvertently reveals. What does this decision say about how he sees me? That question is deeply personal because inheritance is like an evaluation, not a legal or formal evaluation, but an emotional one. And emotional judgments often hurt more deeply than any financial figure. The more a family tries to maintain a calm exterior, the more intensely the underlying emotions surge. Everyone wants to do the right thing. But what is truly right when pain and interpretation clash? Should you speak up, risking being seen as ungrateful? Or should you remain silent and let resentment grow slowly over time? Do you accept the existing structure to maintain harmony, or challenge it to protect your own dignity? These aren't theoretical questions. They only arise once in a lifetime and can never be resolved quickly or neatly. Behind the glamorous facade of a respected Hollywood family lie real people confronting uncomfortable truths. They gradually realize that love and power don't always go hand in hand. Provision doesn't equate to understanding. Inheritance can be both a gift and a burden. And perhaps the most painful realization of all is that no one can ask Rob Reiner the true meaning behind his decisions anymore. His intentions have vanished with him. All that remains are interpretations. And once those interpretations are formed, they are difficult to reconcile. As the family confronts this new reality, they begin to realize a quiet but disturbing truth. Wealth divides not only riches, it divides perspectives. And when perspectives differ, unity becomes fragile. Because families rarely break apart because of money. They break apart because of the meaning attached to that money. As the story moves into its next phase, the focus shifts from internal conflicts to something even more unsettling. It's the moment when decisions made long ago are finally revealed in full. There's a vast difference between knowing a structure exists and actually reading through its every detail. And as those details gradually surface, things don't remain the same. What happens next shows that silence, once considered a protective shield, becomes its most dangerous force. And no one is truly prepared for what that silence reveals. What happens if the most important choices are those never publicly discussed? That question weighs heavily from the very first moments, because by now, the family understands something unsettling. This estate wasn't formed at the last minute. It wasn't decided hastily. It wasn't a reaction to an unexpected event. It was planned quietly and carefully over many years, and the silence was an integral part of that plan. When thinking about inheritance planning, many people picture a single moment, a lawyer's office, thick stacks of documents, a signature at the bottom. But on this scale, things don't unfold that way. Here, inheritance planning is a protracted process, a living structure, constantly changing and adapting with the increase in assets, the shifting of relationships, and personal beliefs. This means that decisions aren't made just once. They are reviewed, adjusted, and reconsidered again and again. And each adjustment reflects a specific moment, an emotion, an assumption, a judgment. It is here that the emotional weight of the silence becomes unbearable. Because when people don't know the reasoning behind a decision, they fill in the gaps themselves. And in such moments, the human mind rarely chooses the most benevolent interpretation. Behind the spotlight and the stories told on screen, Rob Reiner spent years contemplating one core principle: order, not chaos. Order. He understood a truth many only realize when it's too late. Unmanaged money can destroy a family faster than money divided in a way that not everyone feels is fair. So he orchestrated, organized, and tried to anticipate conflicts even before they formed. And in the process, he made a decisive choice. He chose not to explain things. Not fully, not publicly, not with emotional overtones. Perhaps he believed that explanation would only fuel anxiety. Perhaps he thought clarity would come naturally over time. Perhaps he didn't want to provoke unnecessary debates. Or perhaps, in his mind, the intention was clear enough not to need to be stated. But intention doesn't operate on its own. It needs context. And context vanishes when the person holding it is no longer present. As the family began to examine the documents closely, patterns began to emerge. Not shocking events, not extreme decisions, but deliberate calculations. Layers of defenses were superimposed. Control mechanisms were embedded within other control mechanisms. The preventative measures were designed to deal with mistakes that hadn't even happened yet. On paper, everything seemed reasonable, prudent, and responsible. But emotionally, they created a cold distance. That very distance stirred up a silent question that no one dared to voice initially. What was he afraid of? Fear is rarely mentioned in the context of inheritance planning. People prefer to call it prudence, foresight, responsibility. But fear and responsibility are not mutually exclusive. They often go hand in hand. Fear of mismanagement, fear of exploitation, fear of regret, fear of being remembered as careless. That fear doesn't equate to a lack of love. It reflects a desire for control. And control, when imposed without explanation, is easily perceived as judgment. As each clause was read aloud, family members were forced to translate the legal language into the language of emotion. Is this clause meant to protect assets or to limit autonomy? Does this structure ensure stability or implicitly express a lack of trust? Does this condition encourage responsibility or punish independence? The documents don't answer those questions. They can't, because documents have no voice. They only enforce. And enforcement without dialogue always feels cold and distant. This is the unpleasant downside of silence. To the person choosing it, silence seems neutral. To the recipient, it takes on the appearance of deliberate intent. Rob Reiner may believe that not discussing these decisions protects his family, that sparing them the complications will ease their burden. But in reality, that silence only delays the emotional impact until the worst possible time, after the loss, when the pain has not yet subsided and the ability to cope is weakest. Those decisions weren't wrong. This needs to be emphasized. They are carefully constructed, clearly structured, serving to preserve assets and prevent chaos. But they are incomplete because they lack emotional interpretation. They don't answer the question why. And when people don't know why, they speculate about motives. When families confront the reality of those choices, memories begin to surface. Old conversations take on a different tone. Old advice sounds like commands. Distances once considered circumstances now seem intentional. Are these decisions the result of those moments? Or were those moments misinterpreted from the start? This is when silence becomes dangerous, because it allows the past to be rewritten through the emotions of the present. People begin to reinterpret history through the lens of what they are experiencing. It's not a deliberate distortion. It's a survival instinct. The human mind always seeks coherence. It needs a plausible story. And when the only person who can shed light on that story is gone, that story must be constructed from multiple perspectives. Each person fills that void with their own version. Some see generosity. Some feel disappointment. Some retain faith. Others sow doubt. And when those versions no longer align, consensus becomes almost impossible. As time passes, the weight of decisions made in silence begins to sink in, not through dramatic confrontations, but through weariness, through repetitive conversations revolving around the same question, yet never answered, through the silent realization that some things will forever remain unexplained. Here lies a bitter paradox. Rob Reiner dedicated his life to telling stories constructed to resolve conflict, to illuminate emotions, to give the audience a sense of completeness when the screen closes. Yet his own story, at least to those closest to him, ends in an unsolved silence. It wasn't because he was indifferent, but because he believed that structure would speak for him. And structure doesn't speak the language of pain. It only speaks the language of permanence. As the family members confronted this reality, another truth gradually emerged. These decisions were never solely about money. They concerned inheritance, shaping behavior from an unattainable distance, encouraging some paths, while silently closing others. This realization was unsettling, forcing each person to confront a painful question. Am I trusted to choose my own path? Or am I merely being led down the path he desires? That question has no clear answer. And the longer the silence lasts, the heavier it becomes. The silence, once seen as a protective shield, now felt like abandonment. Not a physical absence, but an emotional one. A feeling arises that, at the most crucial moment, guidance is lost. And that feeling doesn't dissipate. It solidifies. It becomes the foundation for unnamed resentments. It is here that the intensity of emotion shifts abruptly. The family reacts not only to what has been decided, they react to how those decisions were made, in silence, without dialogue, without reassurance, without a chance to ask a simple question like, "Do you mean that's how you feel?" When this is realized, everything shifts. Acceptance gives way to scrutiny. Trust gives way to analysis. Each clause is reread. Each condition is examined again, not to deny its legitimacy, but to uncover its intent. And intent, when left unexplained, becomes entirely subjective. From the same text, each person sees a different story. That difference is incredibly dangerous, because when people no longer share a common story, the bond begins to crumble. As this chapter closes, one thing becomes painfully clear. The decisions themselves may have been made carefully, but it is the silence surrounding them that is the real source of the pain. Because silence doesn't prevent conflict, it only delays it. And when conflict finally erupts, it will erupt violently and uncontrollably. As we move on to the next section, that pent-up conflict finally surfaces. For there will be a moment when paperwork ceases to be an abstract concept, when legal language clashes directly with raw human emotions, when the silence becomes unbearable. That moment comes when pain confronts the reality of enforcement, and what happens afterward will transform the simmering discomfort into something far more explosive. No one is prepared for the consequences. What happens when the role that made your name refuses to let go? That question quietly lingers beneath the surface as we move forward. Because the public always believes they understand origin stories. They like them concise, inspiring, easy to retell in interviews or reminiscences. But true origin stories don't end when the spotlight comes on. They resonate long after the applause has faded. For Rob Reiner, that impact never truly subsided. There's a name almost everyone knows, a name that evokes an entire era: Meathead. That nickname alone speaks volumes about the weight of the role. Michael Stivic is not simply a character on screen. He's an icon of a generation, the focal point of heated debates, representing a transforming America right in its own family dinner table. Night after night, millions of viewers watched the tense confrontations between him and Archie Bunker. The old world clashed with the new. Tradition confronted progress. Certainty clashed with idealism. And Rob Reiner embodied that conflict so convincingly that the line between his character and his true self blurred. Ask yourself, if the entire nation believes they know who you are, even before you fully understand yourself, how can you escape that image? Fame that comes too early doesn't give you a chance to experiment in silence. It doesn't allow for private failure. Every action is scrutinized. Every choice feels permanent. For a young actor, that can be both captivating and suffocating. Rob Reiner not only learned to act under that immense pressure, but he also had to learn strategic thinking when surrounded by it. Because when you become famous at a sensitive moment in social and cultural life, you quickly realize a harsh truth: conformity is incredibly fragile. The characters celebrated today can become the laughingstock tomorrow, and that fear doesn't disappear once you've succeeded. In many cases, it grows with fame, haunting and compelling you to constantly find a way out of your own shadow. Thank you for watching until the end of this video. If you find this story offers you a new perspective, don't forget to support the channel, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss other insightful and authentic content. Your support is our greatest motivation to continue telling stories worth listening to.